Well, I think in previous generations, when people abandoned evangelical convictions, they became liberal. And liberal Christian was a term that they would use to describe themselves. However, today, most liberal churches are dying and declining. So in my country, most of the denominations that would be liberal in their theology are in catastrophic decline. Their member numbers are falling very rapidly, and many of the congregations are very elderly. So the growing sector of the church is the evangelical sector of the church. One of the results of that is that many people who deviate from historic evangelical doctrine, they don't identify themselves as liberal anymore. Liberal is not an attractive badge and label that people want to keep. So what they would rather do is keep saying that they are evangelical, because that keeps them alongside those who are experiencing growth and those who are moving forwards. So I think there are various sociological reasons why today people who abandon evangelical convictions want to keep calling themselves evangelical. And what they would do is rather redefine evangelical so that they can keep wearing the label. So I think that's part of the dynamic that is happening. Also, another reason is that I think that many of the arguments that are used today by people abandoning those convictions are arguments of interpretation. So today they will say, it's not that I'm rejecting the Bible, it's just I'm bringing a different interpretation to it. So they will say, I'm still an evangelical because I believe the Bible, and what I'm teaching now is what I believe the Bible to teach because I've interpreted it in a way. So in a sense, they won't say I'm abandoning the Bible, but they'll claim that what they're doing is they're bringing a new, and they would say better, interpretation to the Bible. Now, of course, in many cases, the interpretation that they're bringing has no basis whatsoever. Their arguments are very weak. So, for example, on homosexuality, those who want to argue that somehow the Bible has a more positive view of homosexuality, there's no biblical support for that. And so therefore their arguments and their exegesis, they're not logical. They're justifying a position that people want to hold to fit in with society. But they will say, I've got a right to have my interpretation, and I'm just as much an evangelical as you, even though we arrive at very different conclusions. So the battleground is often sort of phrased not in terms of believing the authority of the Bible, but the interpretation of the Bible. So Steve Chalk, who I mentioned earlier, who has sort of adopted a belief that same-sex marriage is right and appropriate, he would say he's being even more biblical by finding sort of that position. And so therefore he'd claim he's even more evangelical than the evangelicals. So liberalism is no longer a term that people identify with. And because the issue is often interpretation, people want to use the evangelical language. I would also say that in many cases, there's far more money and kudos within evangelicalism. And people want to keep receiving the generous giving of evangelical people. So evangelicals are very generous in giving towards ministries and giving towards the support of churches. So people have an economic interest in saying that they are still within the evangelical community, because that enables them to sort of have access to that funding. And many of the generous Christian people, evangelical people, may not be as aware of the way that their convictions have changed.